Welcome to the Delaware Public Archives' first Saturday program detailing the 2nd Delaware service during the American Civil War. During this episode, I'm going to cover the 2nd Delaware's formation in the spring and summer of 1861 up through the Antietam campaign of 1862. First off, the firing on Fort Sumter, which sparked the American Civil War, occurred on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces fired on Union forces that were garrisoned in the fort, creating what we now know as the American Civil War. Upon the firing on Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln issued a call for men to enlist in the Army, and so Delaware would answer that call by furnishing a 3-month regiment of volunteers that would be known as the 1st Delaware Regiment Volunteer Infantry 3-month unit. The regiment would be formed in May of 1861 and would be mustered out of service in August of 1861, serving their 3 months. During this time, they would be competing with what would become the 2nd Delaware for recruiting men. The 2nd Delaware would begin to be organized in May of 1861, although the ranks would not be filled until October of 1861. Pictured is John B. Mogg, a German immigrant who came to the United States in the 1840s and would go on to enlist in the 1st Delaware 3-month unit in Company B as a private. After he would be discharged from the regiment when it was disbanded, he would go on to enlist in the 2nd Delaware as a corporal and serve throughout the remainder of the war. As I said, the 1st Delaware would go on to serve throughout the summer of 1861. The 2nd Delaware would eventually be formed, being completely filled in October of the same year. Companies B, D, and G were from Philadelphia. Company C was from Elkton, Maryland, and they were known as the Elkton Rangers. And the rest of the companies were filled from Kent and Newcastle County, Delaware. The organizer of the regiment would be Captain Henry W. Wharton, who would serve throughout the regiment for a short time and then go on to do other duties. And the regiment would be formed in Wilmington, and they would meet at Camp Brandywine, which was just outside the city. Camp Brandywine would go on to protect the powder mills of DuPont family fame from any outside forces who may try to come and take over. Delaware was a border state, so it's important to note that there were a lot of mixed feelings on both sides of the state. Should the state stay in the Union or should the state secede? It was based a lot on what Maryland did. As we know, Delaware would remain a border state, but they would stay in the Union. Pictured here is Lieutenant Colonel William P. Bailey. He would be an officer in the 2nd Delaware. Some other famous men who would go on to serve in the 2nd Delaware that we'll talk about throughout this series is that of Henry W. Wharton, who I've mentioned previously, Company A's captain David L. Stricker, and his 2nd Lieutenant John Evans, who were best friends from Wilmington, William H. Himbold, who was a 1st Lieutenant in Company D, and Company F's Captain Peter McCullough. Camp Brandywine, as I said, was situated outside of Wilmington, Delaware. It was established to protect the powder mills from outside forces who may try to come and take over. They were the biggest distributor of black powder in the United States and were providing powder to the United States during the war. So it was a pretty big place that Delaware wanted to protect in the United States government. On September 17, 1861, 8 companies of the 2nd Delaware would leave Camp Brandywine and march to Cambridge, Maryland, under Brigadier General H. H. Lockwood. Companies I and K would join in November of 1861. The regiment would remain in Cambridge throughout the winter of 1861 into the spring of 1862, when they would be transferred to Baltimore. And during this time, the 2nd Delaware spent a lot of time in camp going over the School of the Soldier, which is how the soldier would learn basic instruction and manual of arms of how to handle a rifle, how to march in line, learn how to be a soldier, essentially. The 2nd Delaware was an argument of lot. as can be expected with Irish and German immigrants from Philadelphia and Wilmington. They would fight all the time. There's lots of accounts of fistfights occurring in camp. They were a rowdy bunch who loved to drink, and they were also very religious. There were also many religious events that occurred during the winter encampment of 1861 and 62. The 2nd Delaware, playing off of the term as an argument of lot, was very upset that they actually received the title of 2nd Delaware. They felt that they should receive the title of 1st Delaware, being that the 2nd Delaware was actually the first 3-year unit to come about from Delaware. So the 1st Delaware 3-month unit was established. While that regiment was still serving, the 2nd Delaware was formed, thus being the 2nd Regiment to come out of the state of Delaware. When the 1st Delaware 3-month unit's term of enlistment ran out, the state then created the 1st Delaware 3-year unit. So you had the 1st Delaware 3-year unit and the 2nd Delaware 3-year unit. The 2nd Delaware felt that they deserved the title of the 1st Delaware, being that they were the 1st regiment, and the state to be a 3-year unit. As I said, they would move to Baltimore in the spring of 1862 and then be sent to join the Army of the Potomac on May 31st, 1862. And they would be assigned to the 2nd Corps of General Richardson's 1st Division, 3rd Brigade under Brigadier General William H. French, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bailey and Captain Stricker. So to break down Army structure, you've got Corps, Division, Brigade, Regiment. So again, the 2nd Delaware was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, who was under 2nd Corps in the 1st Division of the 3rd Brigade. So under the Army of the Potomac, they would go on to fight in the 7 Days Campaign, which would be the first action that the 2nd would see. So the 7 Days Campaign would take place from June 25th to July 1st, 1862. George B. McClellan was attempting to take Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. And the Army of Northern Virginia was commanded by the newly appointed Robert E. Lee. So the 2nd Delaware was engaged several times, and they would go on to lose about 35 casualties. So the 2nd would go on to fight throughout the summer of 1862 into the fall of 1862. And in September, Robert E. Lee would devise a plan to invade the North, and it would be his first of 2 attempts to breach into the North. So this campaign would become known as the Antietam Campaign. The armies would converge on a small town in Maryland known as Sharpsburg on September 17, 1862. The 2nd Delaware would be under the 2nd Corps, 1st Division of Colonel Brooks's 4th Brigade. The brigade consisted of the 52nd New York, the 57th New York, the 53rd Pennsylvania, and the 2nd Delaware. For any of you who've been to Antietam, it's personally one of my favorite battlefields that you can now visit, as it is completely pristine. There's no McDonald's on the battlefield. It's wide open fields. It looks much to what it would have on September 17, 1862. You can actually go to where the 2nd Delaware fought. They would be engaged at the Sunken Road, which would see heavy fighting on September 17th. And they would go on to fight Anderson's North Carolinians, who were stationed in what would be known as the Bloody Lane. So as you can see here, the 2nd Delaware is in Brooks' Brigade, and they are coming across the field and attacking the Confederates, who are, as I said, positioned in the Sunken Lane. They would end up breaking through only to be called back, which I'm going to go into in a second. General McClellan in his official report would state, quote, "The enemy attempted to gain the right of Richardson's position in a cornfield near Roulette's house, where the division had become separated from that of General French's. A change of front by the 52nd New York and the 2nd Delaware of Colonel Brooks's brigade under Colonel Frank, his 52nd New York, and the attack of the 53rd Pennsylvania sent further to the right to close up the gap in the line, and the movement of the 132nd Pennsylvania and the 7th Virginia of French's division, before referred to, drove the enemy from the cornfield and restored the line," end quote. So, as I said, the 2nd Delaware would end up breaking through the Sunken Lane. The Confederates would end up retreating back across the field, The 2nd Delaware would end up pursuing them along with other members in Brooks's brigade. However, they would be called back by Union commanders, which upset the 2nd Delaware considerably. They started cussing. They were not very happy that the Union forces had told them to stop their charge and fall back in line so the army could regain structure. Thus, they gained the nickname Crazy Delawares because they acted crazy during this fight. And they would continue to have that nickname throughout the war. At the fighting at the Sunken Lane, the 2nd Delaware would go on to lose 12 killed, 2 officers, 42 wounded, and 2 captured, which would equal 58 total men. Total casualties of both Union and Confederate forces would exceed 23,000 killed, wounded, and missing, which is still the single bloodiest day in American history. This photograph is of Confederate dead within the sunken road. As you can see, they're piled high, and there's many accounts of officers and privates and soldiers stating that you could walk throughout the road from body to body. They were so thickly strewn. In a letter from Captain William H. Himbold to Captain Charles Weiss on July 23, 1890, wrote of placing a monument at Antietam in commemoration of the 2nd Delaware's actions. He would go on to write, quote, "Antietam battlefield is the one field above all others that the 2nd Delaware should in some way mark. Our work there and its consequences and effects was simply tremendous. Very few of us know fully the real consequences and effect of that charge. As individual soldiers, we glory in what we did there, but very few understand the condition of things pending just before we made that charge. Old Dick Richardson, our brave old division commander, let us in, not merely to fill up a gap, but to make gaps. We smashed everything in our front. We practically cut Lee's line in 2. This concludes episode 1 of our First Saturday program series detailing 2nd Delaware service. On the next episode, we'll cover the Fredericksburg campaign and the 2nd Delaware's involvement.